Welcome, everybody. So good to have you here today. I hope you're having a great weekend so far, and I'm glad that you've included Parker Hill Community Church in your weekend so that we could be here to learn together and refocus our hearts on the most significant issues of our lives. Today, I want to talk to you about how to respond to the people in our lives who have hurt us in some way. Talk about how to respond when anger begins to rise up within you and begins to churn in your heart. But let me begin with a little survey, okay? On every campus, go ahead, feel free to raise your hand. How many of you have ever played the game Angry Birds? Go ahead, raise your hands. Okay, good number of people with too much spare time on their hands. Angry Birds, in case you don't know, is like the most popular digital game that's ever been created. It's been downloaded onto to phones and iPads and iPods over 1 billion times. Very, very popular. But here's the plot of this particular game. What happens in this game is that there's this bunch of pigs that steal eggs from some birds. And then these pigs build these structures, and they laugh at you. And the birds, of course, are very angry. So what the birds do is they launch themselves out of a catapult, and you help them do that, and they crash into these structures that the pigs have built in an effort to damage them. Now, here's the funny thing about Angry Birds. Do you know what happens to the bird at the end of each one of these catapults? It dies. Yes, it just kind of rolls around, then explodes. The bird dies. And I thought, man, that's a pretty good picture of what happens when we process anger the wrong way. Like, that's the way a lot of people respond to the hurts and the mistreatment in life. You know, we lash out at people, we try to damage them, but in trying to damage them, we end up destroying ourselves spiritually and emotionally. And so today I want to talk about a different alternative. It's called forgiveness. And this is week number 5 in this teaching series called Ordinary Joe. We've been focusing on the life of Joseph. His true story is told in the book of Genesis, the very first book in the Bible. And Joseph, in many, many ways, he was a very ordinary guy, and yet he lived an extraordinary life. And there was a reason why Joseph, being so ordinary, could live such an extraordinary life. This was really the secret to his life. We come back to this theme week after week, that Joseph did what any ordinary person would do, who is confident that God is with him. In good times and hard times, in the peaks and the valleys, when things are going well, when things really stink, Joseph just did what any ordinary person would do, who is confident that God is with him. And today we come to a part of Joseph's story in a time in his life when he had the perfect opportunity. I mean, I'm talking the perfect opportunity to settle the score, to get even with people who had really wounded him. But do you know what Joseph does instead? He does what any ordinary person would do who is confident that God is with him. Now, before we get too far into Joseph's story, I want you to think about your own story. I want you to call to mind the face or the name of a person who in some way, shape, or form has hurt you, who has mistreated you. Maybe it's current history. Maybe it's years and years in the past. Who would that person be? Maybe it's that person who stole your innocence from you when you were a child. Maybe it's that man or that woman who promised you that they would love you till death parts you. But then someone more appealing came along and they left. Maybe it's just your next door neighbor who's just obnoxious and throws loud parties late into the night. Maybe it's something that simple. Maybe you're a high school student, and the person who makes your life difficult is that student that sees you every day and just seems to make it their mission in life to make sure that you have a bad day. You know, maybe it's your ex-spouse who's constantly fighting with you over custody or over financial matters. You know, who is that person in your life that's hurt you, that's wounded you in some way? Or maybe if you can't recall someone to mind, if you don't have a situation in your life like that currently, here's what I'll guarantee you. There will come a time when someone hurts you in some way, and they may even hurt you deeply. So the time to prepare for that and to prepare how you're going to respond is right now. And here's what I've discovered. When I've been hurt, when I've been disappointed, when I'm dealing with anger, the best thing to do is to do this. Don't just look back, look up. Don't just look back, look up. And here's what I mean by that. It's so tempting for us to just look back and to relive those circumstances and to rehearse that pain and to just live in that kind of self-pity and replay those tapes over and over again. And you can do that if you want to do that. But I think it's far better to not just look back, but to look up and say, God, I'm going to trust in you, and I'm going to trust that you're bigger than this injustice, and I'm going to trust that you can take even this pain in my life and use it for something good. And I believe that this is what Joseph does in his life. He doesn't just look back. He looks up, and he lives as any ordinary person would live who is confident that God is with him. So if you have a Bible, turn to Genesis. Today we're in chapter 42, first book of the Bible, Genesis. If you don't have a Bible with you, that's okay. The passage will be on the side screen as well. But do take out this bulletin insert, the note sheet from inside your bulletin, and we're going to cover the outside, and then on the inside are the app notes, and you can cover those this week on your own. Now, for the sake of those who haven't been here again, let me just do a little bit of review. We began this series 5 weeks ago. And we said that Joseph grew up in a home that was dysfunctional with a capital D. His brothers literally hated him to the point where they wanted to kill him, but the only thing that stopped them from killing him was the fact that they had a chance to sell him into slavery and make a few bucks. And so chapter 37 says this: his brothers pulled Joseph up out of the cistern and sold him for 20 shekels of silver to the Ishmaelites, who took him to Egypt. And so at the age of 17, Joseph gets sold into slavery, goes to Egypt, spends the first few years of slavery in Egypt in the household of a man named Potiphar. But then things go from bad to worse because Joseph is accused of a crime that he doesn't commit, and he gets thrown in jail. So he goes from a slave to a prison inmate. Chapter 39, Joseph's master took him and put him in prison, the place where the king's prisoners were confined. And so, from the age of 17 until the age of 30, Joseph was either a slave or a prisoner in Egypt, and it was all because of his brothers. And if anyone in history had a right to be angry, it was him. His brothers had torn him away from his home, from his family, from everything that was familiar to him. His brothers had stolen from him the best years of his life. And Joseph should have been angry. And yet, he doesn't respond with anger. We'll see how he responds in just a moment. Last week, we looked at chapter 41. We saw how Joseph, then at the age of 30, has this incredible and significant change in fortune. And literally goes from rags to riches, wakes up one morning still in prison. By the end of the day, he goes to sleep in a palace. And Joseph becomes the second most powerful man in the most powerful nation in the world at that time. Second in command to the king of Egypt. And Joseph is put in charge of managing all the resources of Egypt during a time of great famine. And so here's how chapter 41 ends, verse 57. And all the world came to Egypt to buy grain from Joseph because the famine was severe everywhere. Okay, now that we're all caught up, here's where the story takes another very, very fascinating turn. Chapter 42, verse 1. When Jacob, and this is Joseph's father, when Jacob learned that there was grain in Egypt, he said to his sons, and I love this, why do you just keep looking at each other? It sounds like a father, doesn't it? He continued, I have heard that there is grain in Egypt. Go down there and buy some for us so that we may live and not die. Then 10 of Joseph's brothers went down to buy grain from Egypt. These would be the same 10 who had thrown him into the pit so many years before. But Jacob did not send Benjamin, Joseph's brother, with the others because he was afraid that harm might come to him. Now, just a reminder, Benjamin was the youngest son, and Benjamin was the only full-blooded brother of Joseph. Joseph and Benjamin were the only two children of Rachel, Jacob's favorite wife. That's another long story. Rachel had actually died giving birth to Benjamin. And so after Joseph disappears, Benjamin actually becomes Jacob's new favorite son, and he doesn't want anything to happen to him, and so he protects him fiercely. So Benjamin stays home. The other 10 go down to find some food. Verse 5. So Israel's sons were among those who went to buy grain, for there was famine in the land of Canaan also. Now Joseph was the governor of the land and the person who sold grain to all its people. Dun, 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 dun. This is the big part right here. So when Joseph's brothers arrived, they bowed down to him with their faces to the ground. Remember that dream Joseph had so many years before? As soon as Joseph saw his brothers, he recognized them, but he pretended to be a stranger and spoke harshly to them. "Where do you come from?" he asked. "From the land of Canaan," they replied, "to buy food." Although Joseph recognized his brothers, they did not recognize him. They did not recognize him because the last time they had seen him, he was 17 years old. At this time, Joseph is 39 or 40 years old. His haircut, his dress are Egyptian. He's speaking the Egyptian language, not his Hebrew native tongue. It says later in this chapter that he's speaking to them through an interpreter to hide his true identity. So they show up. They have no idea who he is, but he sees them and he knows exactly who they are. And the last time Joseph had seen these guys, he was on his backside in a pit looking up at them, wondering if he was going to live or die. And for 23 years, he has carried the memory of what his brothers had done to him. Now he has all the power. Let me tell you what, this is the opportunity of a lifetime. What do you do in this moment? I mean, think about all the options that Joseph had at this moment. He could have simply said, no food for you. And he could have let them go home and starve to death. He could have done that. He could have said, well, it looks like you guys have been on a very long journey. May I offer you some accommodations here in Egypt in our prison that I spent most of my 20s in? Or he could have said, there's this guy Potiphar. He's a very good friend of mine. I understand he's looking for some help. May I introduce you to him? And by the way, he's a wonderful wife. I hope you get the chance to meet her. I mean, he has so many options. The truth is, he could have just said the word, and these guys could have been taken out one by one and put to death. No judge, no jury, no recourse. Because Joseph now, the youngest son now, has all the power. What would you do in a moment like that? You know what our natural response is? Our natural response is to hurt them like they hurt us, to settle the score, to even things out. Joseph doesn't do that. Instead of looking back at everything that had happened in the past, Joseph chooses to look up, put his faith in God, and do what any ordinary person would do who is confident that God is with him. Now, the story becomes very interesting at this point. Joseph doesn't reveal himself to his brothers. He keeps his identity a secret. In fact, it ends up actually being a number of months, and after several interactions, that Joseph finally reveals to his brothers his true identity. And I believe that Joseph, even prior to this point, had already forgiven his brothers. He had already dealt with the hurt and the pain of the past. I think he would have had to do that in order to be the kind of leader that he became. He's already dealt with that, but now they show up, and Joseph is faced with a decision. How is he going to re-engage them? Will he be able to reestablish a relationship with them? What does that look like, and how does he move forward? I want to stop at this point in the story, and I want to address some faulty ideas about forgiveness, because I think sometimes when we think about forgiving someone, we don't really understand it. We're confused about it, and so we choose not to forgive because we think it includes things that we're not ready for. So let me talk about three things that forgiveness is not. Okay, number one, forgiveness is not amnesia. Some people think if I truly forgive someone, then I have to forget everything that's ever happened in the past. And here's the truth. That's not realistic. It's not even possible. You can't force yourself to forget anything. And Joseph, even though he had forgiven his brothers, and I believe forgiven them long before they showed up, he still remembered what they had done. In fact, they talk about it later on. So forgiveness is not amnesia. It does not mean that you're automatically going to forget what happened to you, especially if it was a deep, deep wound. But here's the good news on this one. If you truly forgive someone, if you start looking up instead of just looking back, If you stop rehearsing the pain over and over again and you stop retelling your story over and over again to anyone who will listen, eventually the pain begins to subside and the memory will begin to fade somewhat. But forgiveness does not mean forgetting, like the old cliche, forgive and forget. That's not really possible. Number two, forgiveness is not a feeling. Some people believe that if you forgive someone, then you should automatically have this warm and fuzzy feeling toward them. And I think that, if I don't have a warm and fuzzy feeling toward that person, then I must not have forgiven them. Well, forgiveness is not a feeling. In fact, it is quite the opposite. Forgiveness is a choice that we make in spite of how we feel. It's a choice of the will. But then when we choose to forgive, oftentimes the feelings will follow as we live out that forgiveness. So number one, it's not amnesia, it's not a feeling, and forgiveness, number three, is not blind trust. There's a big difference between forgiveness and trust. Years ago when I used to do more counseling, sometimes I'd be in a situation where one or the other of the two people had offended the other party, and then they ask for forgiveness and receive forgiveness, but then they expect that everything is going to just automatically go back to where it was before in the relationship. That doesn't happen. Here's something you can write down, very important phrase. It's not there on the note sheet. Forgiveness lets you start over, but it doesn't put you back to where you were. Forgiveness lets you start over, but it doesn't put you back to where you were. Very important concept to understand here. Big difference between forgiveness and trust. When you think about trust, think about a continuum, okay? And in the middle of that continuum is kind of that neutral ground where, you meet somebody for the first time and you don't distrust them because you don't even know them, but you don't really trust them either because you don't know them. But then let's say you and I begin to build a relationship, and as we build that relationship, that trust level between us goes up and up and up. But then maybe something happens where you offend me or you do something to disappoint me, and that trust goes way back down. And then I forgive you. But when I forgive you, the trust doesn't automatically go back up. Forgiveness means that we kind of start over and we restart the relationship and begin to build trust again. See, a big difference between forgiveness and trust. That's why, if you're dealing with somebody who's been incredibly irresponsible with their finances, you don't say, I forgive you, and here's 3 more credit cards. Okay, that's not forgiveness, that's stupidity. Okay, so forgiveness is not amnesia, it's not a feeling, it's not blind trust. Now, I mention that because I think that may help you to understand why Joseph does what he does in relationship with his brothers here over the next few chapters. It's very interesting. Many people are puzzled by this part of the story of Joseph because he continues to kind of maintain his distance. He doesn't tell his brothers right away who he is. In fact, it's probably months later when he finally tells them. But he wants to reestablish a relationship with them, but he's not sure if it's the right time. He's not sure they're ready. He's wondering, are these the same guys that they were 23 years ago? Are their hearts any more tender toward God? Can I really trust them? And throughout the story, Joseph seems to be so torn. In fact, it says 3 times in the next couple of chapters that he weeps. So let me summarize what happens. They show up. Joseph begins to question them, and as he questions them, they disclose that they have another younger brother back home. Joseph knew this, but they say that. And so he says, okay, I want you to prove to me that you're not spies. I'm going to send you home with some grain, just a little bit to get you by, but then when you come back, you must bring your younger brother with you. So they get some grain, they go home. They tell their father Jacob what has happened, and Jacob is dead set against Benjamin ever going to Egypt. Remember, he already lost Joseph. He doesn't want to lose another one of his sons, and so he's adamant about it. He says, Benjamin will not leave this home. But guess what? Eventually, they run out of food, and they've got to go back to the only place that has food, Egypt. But all the boys know that governor, Joseph, they don't know he's Joseph, but the governor had told them in no uncertain terms that when they come back, they'd better bring their younger brother with them. So Eventually they get hungry enough and all the boys go back to Egypt to get some grain. So they get there, they get some grain. They even have a party at the house of, this governor, this guy who's in charge of all the food. But then they're getting ready to leave and they're loading up the grain that they have purchased. And Joseph plants a silver cup in the grain sack of Benjamin. And so all the boys head off, and then Joseph sends his posse out after them to stop them. And they accuse these guys of stealing the silver cup that belongs to the second most powerful man in the world. And they, of course, deny, up, down, and sideways that they've taken it. So one at a time, they unload the sacks of grain, and sure enough, inside Benjamin's sack is the silver cup. And at this point, these guys know that they are in deep weeds. They are in trouble. Here's what Joseph says, all the way to chapter 44, verse 17. He says, the man who was found to have the cup will become my slave. The rest of you, go back to your father in peace. Here's what's happening here. Joseph is testing them. This is the moment of truth. Because remember something, 23 years before this, they had had the opportunity to get rid of Joseph, and they took it immediately. Now they have an opportunity to get rid of Benjamin, the new favorite son, the only fully blood brother of Joseph. Now they have the opportunity to get rid of him and go home scot-free. How are they going to respond to this? Judah speaks up. Judah, by the way, was the one who said, let's kill Joseph. Verse 33, he speaks to Joseph, the governor. Now then, he says, please let your servant remain here as my Lord's slave in place of the boy, and let the boy return with his brothers. How can I go back to my father if the boy is not with me? No, do not let me see the misery that would come on my father. See, 23 years ago, he had said, let's kill him. Now he says, I'm willing to die in his place. His heart is completely changed. And so at this point, Joseph knows it's time. It's time to unveil the truth and disclose who he really is. And that brings us to chapter 45, verse 1. Then Joseph could no longer control himself before all his attendants. And he cried out, have everyone leave my presence. So there was no one with Joseph when he made himself known to his brothers. And he wept so loudly that the Egyptians heard him, and Pharaoh's household heard about it. Joseph said to his brothers, I am Joseph. Is my father still living? But his brothers were not able to answer him because they were terrified at his presence, with good reason. For all they know, he has spent the last 23 years nursing a grudge against them. For all they know, he's been planning for 2 decades how to get even with them if he ever saw them again. So they are terrified in his presence. Verse 4, then Joseph said to his brothers, come close to me. And they're like, I don't think so. He says, come close to me. He wants them to look into his eyes, to see the pigment of his skin and know that he is a Hebrew, to see the resemblance that he has to their father Jacob. And when they had done so, he said, I am your brother Joseph, the one you sold into Egypt. And now do not be distressed and do not be angry with yourselves for selling me here. A complete absence of any bitterness. A complete absence of any desire to make them pay for what they had done. So let me tell you 3 things that forgiveness is. I told you 3 things that forgiveness is not. Here are 3 facets of forgiveness. Number 1, it means refusing to seek revenge. Refusing to seek revenge. Which, by the way, is so unnatural to us. Because when someone hurts us, the thing that we naturally want to do is hurt them back. We want to get revenge. It's like an old story. I think I've told you this story before about a truck driver who shows up at a diner one day and sits down at the counter for lunch. And then a few minutes later, these 3 big, burly, rough-looking guys on motorcycles come into the diner as well. And they decide they're going to have a little fun with this truck driver. So one of them goes over and takes a bite out of his sandwich. Another one goes over and drinks from his coffee cup. The third one goes over and just pours sugar all over the rest of his food. And the truck driver doesn't respond. He doesn't get upset. He just pays his bill and calmly walks out of the diner. And these rough, burly motorcycle guys, they're kind of upset that they didn't provoke him into a fight. And one of them turns to the waitress and said, I guess he's not much of a man, is he? The waitress says, I guess not. Then she looks out the window. She says, I guess he's not much of a truck driver either. He just backed over 3 motorcycles out there in the parking lot. Like, that's what we all want to do, right? When somebody hurts us, we want to hurt them back. One of the readings in your app notes this week is from Romans 12, beginning in verse 17. Listen to this. It says, do not repay anyone. Key word, because last I checked, anyone means anyone. Do not repay anyone evil for evil. Be careful to do what is right in the eyes of everyone. If it is possible, as far as it depends on you, live at peace with everyone. It says, if it is possible, as far as it depends on you. Because the truth of the matter is, you can't always live at peace with everyone because some people won't allow that to happen. But he goes on, verse 19. Do not take revenge. Refuse to seek revenge. Do not take revenge, my friends, but leave room for God's wrath, for it is written, it is mine to avenge, I will repay, says the Lord. So forgiveness, first of all, means this, that I'm going to refuse to seek revenge. And then secondly, it means this, I'm going to choose to trust God. I'm going to choose to trust God. That's what Joseph does here. I'm going to keep reading now in verse 5, and here's what it says. And now, do not be distressed, and do not be angry with yourselves for selling me here, because it was to save lives that, underline this phrase, that God sent me ahead of you. For 2 years now there has been famine in the land, and for the next 5 years there will be no plowing and reaping. But God sent me ahead of you to preserve for you a remnant on earth and to save your lives by a great deliverance. So then it was, underline this, not you who sent me here, but God. See, Joseph was not trying to excuse what they had done. He was not trying to minimize their sin. He was simply declaring the fact that God was bigger than all that. And he was reminding them and declaring the fact that God can take even the wicked actions of other people and leverage those and weave them into his plan to accomplish something good. And I believe that Joseph was able to set aside all the hurt, all the bitterness, all the justifiable anger, because he was confident that God was with him, even in those times when he was being treated so badly. And I'll tell you what, it is so much easier to forgive the people who hurt you when you believe with all your heart that there is a God who is in control, and that God can take even the worst actions of other people in our lives and somehow use them for his greater purposes, and we don't have to sweat it. We don't have to worry about making them pay. We can just trust God with all of that. And every once in a while, you get to look in the rear view mirror of life and really see how this plays out. I've had a couple of examples of that. I'll give you one example. Years and years ago, there was another church in our community that went through a very, very difficult time. And it was just a messy situation, and a lot of people left the church. There was just a lot of division in that church. And some of those people came to Parker Hill Community Church, although it wasn't called that at the time, but they came to our church. And in the fall of 1988, I was a single pastor at the time. I'm walking around greeting people before the Sunday morning worship service begins, and I meet this young lady by the name of Debbie. Now, that was her first time in church. Her parents had started attending the church because they had left this other church that had gone through so many problems. And so I struck up a conversation with Debbie. And that was the first of many conversations that we would have. And 4 years later, Debbie and I got married. Now, I am fully convinced that I wouldn't be here and I wouldn't be doing what I'm doing today if I had not married the wife that God had given to me. But here's the interesting thing. She and I never would have met if it had not been for a church split, for people being very angry with each other and making oftentimes some poor decisions and all of that. God used even a terrible, painful thing to bring, in my opinion, something very good out of it. And that isn't even the end of the story, because about 10 years ago in that same church, the believers in that church got to a point where they were struggling, and some of them came to us and said, you know what, maybe we could find a way to work together. And at that point, around 2003, 2004, we were absolutely out of space. We had no more room. We were doing 5 services a weekend, trying to figure out where to fit people in. And so we ended up merging with that church, and we started doing this thing called multi-site ministry. And now we have 3 campuses in 2 counties, all because of something very, very painful in the lives of some people. See, I believe that God can take even the most difficult relational problems in our lives and still use those to accomplish some good. And so in times when we want to get sideways with somebody else, and when we're upset and we're angry and we're hurt, what we need to do is we just got to trust God. We got to say, God, I know that you're bigger than all of this. Choose to trust God. Number 3, then the third facet of forgiveness is this: just deciding to bless when cursed. Deciding to bless when cursed. And this is like graduate level forgiveness right here. Go back to Romans chapter 12. Do not take revenge, my dear friends, but leave room for God's wrath. For it is written, it is mine to avenge, I will repay, says the Lord. So choose to trust God. And then on the contrary, it says, if your enemy is hungry, feed him. If he is thirsty, give him something to drink. In doing this, you will heap burning coals on his head. Do not be overcome by evil, but overcome evil with good. And do you know what? This is exactly what Joseph does. His enemy was hungry. He feeds his enemy. He overcomes evil with good. Back to Genesis chapter 45 and verse 9. He says this, and now, hurry back to my father and say to him, this is what your son Joseph says. God has made me Lord of all Egypt. Come down to me, don't delay. You shall live in the region of Goshen and be near me, you, your children and grandchildren, your flocks and herds and all you have. I will provide for you there, because 5 years of famine are still to come. Otherwise, you and your household and all who belong to you will become destitute. So the whole family moves down to Egypt. Kids, grandkids, they move right into Joseph's neighborhood, and they have barbecues together, and they raise their kids together, and their kids are on the same Little League team as Manasseh and Ephraim, and they're getting together for holidays, and it's just a beautiful, beautiful scene. Do you know why that was possible? Because he chose, instead of just looking back, to look up and to respond as anyone would do who is confident that God is with them. So what does it mean to forgive? It means to refuse to seek vengeance and choose to trust God and decide to bless when you are cursed. And today, as we end our time together, we want to focus our attention on God's love toward us and be reminded of the greatest forgiveness in history, the forgiveness that we ourselves have experienced from God himself. We're going to end our time together today with the celebration of communion. And as we prepare for that, I just want you to bring to mind 3 crosses on a hill just outside the city of Jerusalem almost 2,000 years ago. And if you had been there on that Friday afternoon and seen those 3 crosses, you would have looked at the cross in the middle and you would have seen Jesus, a man who had healed the sick and fed the hungry and loved the outcast, a man who had never done anything wrong, the man who was, we believe, the Son of God. And if you had been there on that Friday afternoon looking at that scene, you probably would have said to yourself, God, I don't understand this. It seems as if evil men are winning the day. God, how can this be? God, why are you allowing this to happen? But then it was only a few days later on Easter morning when it all made sense and when all of human history began at that point to understand that the thing that seemed like the greatest evil in human history was actually used to accomplish the greatest good in human history, your forgiveness and mine. And do you know that on that Friday afternoon, as Jesus was being crucified, as men were driving nails into his feet and into his hands, he prayed for them. And he said, Father, forgive them, because they don't know what they're doing. How could he pray a prayer like that? How could he just allow that to happen? Very simple. Because he chose to look up and trust his Father. 1 Peter chapter 2 says it this way: when they hurled their insults at him, he did not retaliate. When he suffered, he made no threats. Instead, he entrusted himself to him who judges justly. And he is our example of what it means to respond in those times of hurt, those times of injustice, those times of mistreatment, to respond as people who are confident that God is with us because he is.